Hey, Jake. Freezing your camera with your thumbs up right before we're live.
Yeah,
it's great.
I like to do a little bit of Apple stuff.
No, you're still within the timeout. It only lets it do it every once in a while.
See what I can do. There we go. I got some balloons.
You gotta turn this off. This has been a running bit on this show for like a month now. Then it freezes your camera. Casey Dreier is here with us, and this is how you're starting the show. What the hell?
I have standards after all.
You're back, Casey. Yeah. You're back.
I'm back.
I feel like the last time we talked to you was before the event horizon of life.
Literally, right? On the before my daughter was
Quite
born.
Actually, yes.
yes.
How are things? You doing all right?
Doing great. Really wonderful. She's about 6 months old now. It's been interesting. I was just at a workshop for the Search for Life, and I feel like I'm watching life develop, kind of like present itself to me. And intelligent, right? The search for intelligent life is like actively developing in front of me. It's a wonderful experience. She's a great baby.
That's great.
Before you were a parent, you were like, the search for life involves looking for biosignatures and all this science, and now you're just like, you just look for the mess and the tired people. That's where life is, really.
Yeah, life is pretty presented. Like it is nothing subtle about this experience. Plenty of biosignatures, though. If you'd like them, I throw them out multiple times a day.
I just welcomed a new puppy into the house, and so I am also feeling the biosignatures thing. Yeah, I had a little discovery under my desk this morning that I didn't notice.
It's like, oh, cool, a sample.
A wow signal.
It was
a
wow signal. Yeah, an Earth sample. That's for sure. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, so that's what we're here for.
That's the topic. I mean, I assume I'm here to show baby pictures for the next hour because
Jake's
new
puppy was in the pre-show, so this is we're in the right direction here.
Yeah. No, we're gonna talk about.
Lighter topics.
We are going to talk about biosignatures. Mars sample return, that's biosignature-ish related, right? Adjacent, at least, if not more.
Talk about messes.
It's a major goal.
Talk about messes at JPL.
I was thinking, rarely is the topic of this or the name of this show so apt for the topic.
This is the one.
Yeah. There you go. We're just staying on brand. Just looking for all the off-nominal storylines. So, of course, Casey, we're excited to talk to you about that. Drinks. What do we got going today? Who wants to start today?
Well,
oh boy.
Casey's,
well, I forgot.
Nice and
so
early.
I just have water in an Owala thing.
Yeah, tell us the story of the water bottle, Casey. Give us some context.
He's barely remembering to drink water.
This is why people tune in. I assume. I can't say that I didn't have a. Right after the baby was born, after the in the first couple of months, I would have half a beer and I would fall asleep. So it's definitely a slightly different relationship. I'm up to one now, but that's about where I stop. My 23-year-old self would be quite surprised, but my 40-year-old self says that 23-year-old doesn't know anything, so I'm not too worried about it.
He's out to lunch, yeah. Perfect. I'm
well hydrated at least.
Good. I'm rocking some wine today, Anthony. Yeah,
that's different.
Some friends brought this by. So this is a Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon, Concha y Toro. So
looks nice.
Fun with that. So I don't drink a ton of wine, but I do like it. It's nice to have every once in a while.
When you do, you drink Reservado.
That's a big glass too. That was real full.
This is how you can tell I don't drink much. I don't really know where you're supposed to stop. I'm like the glass is this big. Why wouldn't I go to the top? That's what.
Well, Jake.
So yeah.
I have some props today, Jake.
Oh.
I think it was the 4th episode of this podcast. Was it the 4th, 6th? When we got Ninkazi Brewing sent us beer.
Yes.
I think it was literally like the first half a year of this podcast.
We thought we were so onto something. We thought we're going to get so many beer sponsorships with this show.
This is amazing. Great, right? That was the hops that had flown on a suborbital rocket or something.
Yeah,
I forget what the bit was. After complaining about this, Jake, we have a new beer sponsorship. Okay.
Okay. Good.
This took a while to get to me because it was sent to my PO box, which is in Pennsylvania, and I'm pretty sure the reason that it took a while to get to me is because you're not allowed to send alcohol to people in Pennsylvania, and so I think the first box that was attempted to be sent eventually got destroyed. and the second box got through. Okay, so we got a bunch of beer from Starbase Brewing, which is in Austin, and seems to have a mysterious backstory, because I've invited these fellas on the show, and they were like, can't yet, but maybe soon. So I'm very intrigued to have them on the show, because it used to be called Boca Chica Brewing, and now it is called Starbase Brewing. So Ooh. I'm trying not to do too much math about what the backstory is here, but here's where we're at. And so I've got like 8 t-shirts, maybe 6. I don't know. I got this sweet hoodie.
So the trick is I just have to complain on my podcast that no one's sending me beer.
Loudly.
And people will send me beer because
and apparel. Yes.
And apparel. Well, let it be known.
Presidential campaign. I got everything.
Let it be known on the Space Policy Edition, I will also accept shipments of space-related beer and spirits. And I don't live in Pennsylvania.
So it's much easier to get it to.
Yeah, I'll just put that out there at the Space Policy Edition podcast. We're available on any good podcast network. I will also happily drink submissions. I didn't know you could do that. I mean, I'm out of touch.
Listen, I've got t-shirts for all the beers. I've got so many t-shirts, Jake. Okay, and so I've got a bunch of beers to drink over the next month or so. But today I'm drinking, per the topic, the Terraformer.
There you go.
And it's got a nice little Mars scene. There's some rovers up in there.
Is it a red ale?
It is a Martian style red ale, is what it's called. So I got those, and then rovers? I don't know. Why don't I dole these beers out over the next month? Because I've got 4 different beers. So we'll choose one per show. But today it's the Terraformer.
That sounds like that was their plan. Yeah.
That was So then the other part, we'll just do this live on the air, Jake, is that to whatever extent we want to entertain it, they've said we would like to be the official beer sponsor of Off-Nominal. I said, we don't know what that means, but we're probably in. So we'll sort that one out.
We don't know what that means, but yes, okay.
So that's what we got. Starbase Brewing. There we go.
Right, cool.
Yeah.
Love it. All right.
Now you have the show while I put all these t-shirts away.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so I'm trying to think of where I want to start with this. So maybe, Casey, do you want to, should we do what is the 2-minute rundown of what is happening with Mars sample return? Because that feels like the base layer of context that we need to have to talk about anything else on the show today. So should we do that? What do you think? You've got some articles that have come out recently. It feels like a smart thing to cover.
I can do in 2 minutes. I mean, here we could try to do it real short, which was, Mars sample return. I mean, everyone knows what Mars sample return is, right? It's in the name. Do we need to touch on that?
I don't think so.
This is a learned audience here.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's 3 words that explains the whole thing. So
yeah, I mean, it's kind of in the name. I mean, the really quick summary is Mars sample return had everything going for it, and then it didn't. Mm-hmm. And now they're trying to figure out what to do. I mean, it kind of is. I mean, that's basically the story here, right? They were cruising along, getting all the funding they needed. Had all the partners they had signed up for it, and then suddenly it looked like they had an independent review, analyzed the project, and saw you actually have no chance of making your planned dates. Your costs are going to be at $10 billion or more. You don't have a viable pathway technically at the moment, and your management is just a disaster. And that was done then in the context of a shrinking NASA budget for the first time in 10 years. And suddenly Mars sample return has a very uncertain future and is actually suffering a lot right now. I mean, this is why we're seeing people laid off at JPL is all related to this. Yeah. So it ran into a political landmine based on a series of internal mismanagement and technical challenges that hit the project very suddenly. Yeah. At least visibly very suddenly.
I was trying to figure out, because it feels like, I mean, there's definitely some we dropped the ball happening here, a lot of it, frankly. But I feel like it's also coupled with a really bad stroke of luck, and that this happens right now in this year's budget scenario, which is kind of a nightmare. It's not great to be trying to figure out what's going on with the government funding right now. And I'm trying to figure out where is it 50-50, 70-30? What's going on with that? Because that feels like an interesting kind of context to try and unpack, but I don't know where to go with it.
The odds are that we'll have funding, or the odds for MSR continuing. I think those are two different questions. I mean, yes, you're right. Well, I mean, fundamentally, though, your context is correct. It's hit a series of really bad luck situations, politically speaking. That also there are other major projects explicitly called out as being threatened by MSR in NASA's own budget, which was not a smart or savvy, well, it depends on who was doing it, but not a smart or savvy political thing to do in districts led by, there's also a full changeover of congressional leadership in the appropriations committees, these committees that fund NASA. And for the first time in a long time, there's no leadership position of those committees that has a NASA center in their state or district. So that's a huge shift as well. NASA lost a significant number of longtime stalwart political supporters. You have a shrinking budget. You have other priorities. You have no commitment from NASA. I mean, the other big thing is here that MSR hit a major roadblock or road bump in its design. NASA said, okay, we'll take this independent. We had an independent review last year, right, that said all these problems, gave a ton of recommendations. NASA, in response, rapidly assembled a committee to look at the independent review, right? So that committee, it has not released anything. And it's been almost 6 months, and it looks like that committee is pushing further out, like it's not answering. So there's actually nothing to coalesce around. We don't know what NASA wants to do. And it's a bit of a catch-22, because from what I understand, some of the people inside NASA say, well, we can't decide what to do until we know what our budget is. But then they can't argue, NASA can't say we need this budget because NASA hasn't said what it wants to do. And so Congress is reticent to fund an amorphous thing, right? Have you fixed it? I don't know. It's just a number of bad things happening all at the same time, added to, I think, probably kind of a COVID hangover still that we're seeing in the aerospace industry in terms of lingering inflation. I mean, if you think of it this way, like inflation happened. It happened in the aerospace supply chain. Salaries, costs go up for people to accommodate the cost of everything else in life. So you can kind of think like everything got about 8 to 9% more expensive just to build a spacecraft. But NASA's budget didn't grow to accommodate it either. So every project is suddenly facing a pinch by inflation hitting it. Mm-hmm. So every other project is also running into problems at the same time. And so this is a multivariate disaster.
I think it's even worse. Isn't it like 20%? I thought it was like 20%.
Well, it depends. Right? So NASA's
I guess based on, you're saying like, because it was $22 or whatever, that... I don't know. You're the guy that does math in different dollars. So if it's 8%, it's probably 8% based on whatever the hell baseline you've got in your Excel sheet. The wildest Excel sheet in space.
It's NASA's own inflation index says it's like 4 and 5%. So it's around 9%. And then it's kind of like, is that relative or absolute? Kind of depends when you measure it from. I'd say maybe in easier to say 10%, give or take. But that's a lot.
It's still huge.
So every project is just running into a lot of problems. And
if you think about NASA's budget, that's $2.5 billion, right? That's what that 10% is, right? So it's not an insignificant amount of money.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And you didn't even mention, Casey, that it's an election year. And so
that.
Is anybody willing to solve anything
also
right
with
now?
a really clear election result? No mystery as to what's going to happen this year, right? Like, everyone knows how this election is going to go. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, at the presidential election, a third of the Senate is up for re-election, and all of the House of Representatives is up for re-election, right? Yes, to your point. As we go closer to that election, less and less legislating will happen. And we're seeing that, right? So we're 5 months into the current fiscal year. Now, we don't have a final budget for this fiscal year yet. We have these 2 potential budgets for NASA floating out there. This is one of the reasons why JPL had to lay off so many people. It's not actually because they ran out of money, because we're on a continuing from last year. MSR actually has $800 million on paper to work with this year. But the problem is, at any point, they could go with the Senate's budget and have $300 million. So NASA turns like the NASA accounting and not just NASA, the White House accounting office turns down the knob, turns down the flow of funding to every project to match the lowest of all possible outcomes being presented by the political system. And that's why, so they're spending as if the Senate budget is in force, even though it's not, because it might be, right?
Wait,
so
can you, I wanted to dig in on this specific thing with you. Yeah, like, so that's a thing, is that a policy set by this current administration, or is that a typical way that this happens?
That's the law,
process?
isn't it? That's just how the money works, right?
You know, it's not either. It is, I mean, so it's not the law. It is typical. This is an accounting decision, and it's basically a risk posture. So the issue is, because the budgeteers and the Office of Management and Budget don't know what the final outcome is going to be, they're conservative. They'll say, would you rather, at the end of if you get a budget with 4 months left to go of the year, would you rather have a much more money than you thought you might, or would you rather suddenly have to find hundreds of millions of dollars you already spent? And the answer is always going to be, you need to play the conservative portion, because they can't then have to, how do you claw back money you've spent? How do you claw back money from contracts?
You have to like pause projects or like lay people off immediately or whatever, right? Yeah. So like, I guess when I say it's like the law, what I mean is more like, when you get that much money, that's how much money you have to have already spent. And so like you need to plan for that and try and like anticipate and build as much flexibility into your operation as you can, so that whatever becomes the real appropriation you can hit without too much disruption, right? Yeah.
That's why it's bad to operate this way, right? This is why it's nice to have a budget on time, but also not to have two lingering completely. I mean, most of the time, the House and the Senate aren't completely at odds. Maybe there's some variation, but we have really a bifurcation where the Senate says 300 million or you're canceled. The House says 950 million. That's a difference of $650 million.
Yeah. It's wild.
It's a whole mobile launcher worth of money.
Not even, right? If only.
$20.
Yeah, mobile launcher.
And Apollo dollars.
Yeah, so it's this is what happens. And uncertainty has consequences, right? And this is the most visible, and as you point out, this is hitting at a particularly delicate time. JPL had been staffing up to manage a massive project. And other places too. We don't have as visible, there aren't as many press announcements, and slightly different because it's a NASA center versus JPL, which is a federally funded research and development center, of course, as everyone knows. But Goddard Goddard was building out the containment, capture, and return device, the CCRS, that was going to fly inside the European Mars orbiter, hold the samples launched into orbit by the Mars Ascent vehicle, and then keep it, ultra protected inside its planetary protection box. That was a huge project. That was anywhere between $500 million and $1 billion project. And NASA has, for all intents and purposes, shuttered that project right now. And so Goddard is also suffering from a sudden loss of income, in a sense, or revenue. And they don't have the ability to lay off people the way that JPL does, because civil servants, you have to go through what's called a reduction in force process. It's a whole bureaucratic mess. JPL employees are actually Caltech employees. They're more, it's more like a standard organization rather than a civil service appointment. But a lot of contractors are losing their job at Goddard, and Goddard's having a hard time too. And we believe this is happening at contractors around the country that were depending on this MSR contracts. They had billions of dollars worth of contracts that are basically being tuned down to $0 right now. So these are wide-ranging implications, of which the JPL layoffs are probably the most visible. But this is just a huge mess right now. And again, ironically, if we spin MSR back up, the Senate wanted to keep the money down. They said, you need to save money by, we're going to cut your funding if you can't do this on a cheaper budget. By causing this huge disruption, you were almost going to guarantee the project costs more, right? Because you're laying off so many people, and then you have to hire them all back. You're delayed.
Yeah,
you lose all this.
Hiring's very expensive. So yeah.
Literally, the Mars rovers on the surface of Mars, the day that JPL was going through its layoffs, sat idle. They did not run that day, because everyone at JPL was not working, because no one knew who was getting laid off or not. The whole lab stayed home. No one went into work that day except for absolute minimum personnel. So I think there's like a powerful symbol there of literal, just like the exploration of Mars stopped dead in its tracks due to this insane uncertainty, which again, utterly self-imposed. Sorry, I've been on the soapbox a lot recently about this. So I'm talking a lot.
That's why you're here.
I was just saying, we did invite you. Like, this is part of the
true.
thing.
You know, I talk ad nauseum about these issues.
So how, like, what's the line right now on getting a budget? Like, are we in anywhere close, or is it still like are we looking at a full year CR? Is that a possibility that we're going to just do that and not pass a budget?
I think that is still the most likely outcome. I mean, just to zoom way out, right? The Republicans run the House of Representatives, Democrats run the Senate with the Democrat in the White House. Particularly, again, as you point out, during election year, the differences between the parties start to become more salient as an electoral issue, right? So you want to define yourself against the opposing party in order to say, this is why you vote for me, even if kind of get nothing done as a consequence. It becomes a visual statement. There has been some progress. So the current funding expires in 2 weeks. It's a staggered funding in March 1st and March 8th, the two deadlines. I think NASA's the March 8th deadline. That's when the CR. So they either need to pass another continuing resolution, or they need to pass all 12 spending bills. Congress has gotten, this week rolled up their sleeves and has gone on break for 2 weeks. And so no real work is really necessarily happening on that. There's staff work obviously happening on it, but they're back in their home districts. I am not super idealistic, but again, it's very hard to make money predictions because the inputs are so crazy right now. You have Mike Johnson in the House as the House Speaker, who basically kind of came out of relative obscurity and does not have a long history. Certainly wasn't in leadership in the House at all. There have been some progress. The House and Senate have, at a high level, agreed on overall spending levels now. They were both coming from very different places before, even with last year's debt deal. And what we understand is that the committees, there's, again, everyone I'm sure is familiar with the 302B allocations to the subcommittees of appropriations. It's basically there are 12 subcommittees, all cover different parts of the U.S. government in terms of how they have their jurisdiction of what they tell them to spend. Each subcommittee basically gets us, let's say, just for argument's sake, around $1 trillion. It's the committee divvies that up among the 12 subcommittees. So here is your slice of this pie. And that's what you have to fund all of your agencies under your jurisdiction. And that's a 302B allocation. So if the House and Senate have a different size of that slice, they then write a different funding bill based on that. I think we have, our understanding is that has happened or is happening this week, that an agreed upon level is being distributed to the subcommittees. So
at the subcommittee level, okay, yeah.
So that's sorry. This is like the level of progress.
What year dollars are we talking, Casey? You always gotta give me what year dollars.
This is 2024, right? This is we have agreement of what the starting point is. I mean, and obviously each side has kind of presented out their priorities, but it's that's how far apart we were, that both House and Senate weren't even starting from the same position.
Right.
And so we think that is there now. Whether or not they can pass a budget, I mean, anyone else can look at particularly the House of Representatives now, which has a Republican majority now of 2, one of the tightest majorities in recent history, and see how difficult it is to pass stuff. There used to be, I believe it was called the, oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. There was kind of an informal rule that you always pass something with a majority of the majority, right? So even if like a bill could pass with the majority of the House, you only pass things that have a majority of the controlling party to pass it.
Right. Otherwise, you're not pushing your agenda forward. You're pushing the other party.
Yeah, and it's a function in the last 30, 40 years of an increasing polarized electorate.
Sure.
But that's been particularly in the last 25 years, basically how the House has been run. There is no functional majority in the majority party of the House of Representatives right now. I think we've seen, right, there's some deep schisms in the House of Representatives that make it almost impossible for all of them to vote in bloc to run the House, which means any budget will require some Democratic votes, which means Mike Johnson is imperiling his own leadership if he passes something through, because he can be deposed any moment. As I said, it is a mess. And NASA and MSR chose a terrible time to run into budget problems as a concept, as part of this, though I'm sure that was not their intention.
I was thinking about the full year continuing resolution, right? Which is basically just copy paste last year's budget and run it again this year, because we can't come to an agreement, right? And I think maybe in in November, December, I was like, that would be great for MSR, because then they get the same, 800 million that they got last year, or whatever the number was, a full funding amount, right? Then they can get back to work. But I think as we get later into the actual year, that becomes kind of less true, because if we pass the CR now, yes, you get your full funding, but it doesn't answer the question of, does Congress want to continue this program? And so then that same threat just looms again in October, right? So if you're JPL, you'd be like, oh, we got the CR, staff back up again? Or are you going to be like, no, we're going to try and pull it tight. We're going to spend the money as best we can, but we're going to go tight here because I don't want to fire everybody again in October, right? That would be a pretty tough spot to be in. So I don't know. It feels kind of like crap now. This is a bad time in the year to even be thinking about that, right?
That's a very well how much kudos for that insight. That's very well thought through. That's true, and that's a subtle point, but very important. So, and as long as you, in a sense, have this political uncertainty, even if you do get the money, it does become hard to say, what do you do? And this is, again, why this becomes a very inefficient way to build a spacecraft, and particularly a massive project like this, that you're at. Uncertainty creates inefficiency. And that is what is, in a sense, happening here. And we went through a similar, in some ways, process with James Webb Space Telescope back in 2010, where the House released a budget with $0 for JWST, and the Senate funded it. And it was during a very tumultuous political time as well, during the Tea Party era and sequestration.
Stuff, right? Yeah.
And that was a really rough time for JWST to go through. And obviously that came through, and then had 8 years or 11 years later, I guess, at launch. But obviously it's thriving now. It was obviously worth the investment, but created a huge amount of uncertainty. But once it got through it, and that's what I think is really notable, historically speaking, and this is what I find encouraging, historically speaking, and you can look at the ISS to some degree that survived a House vote by 1, right, back in 93. And other major missions like Cassini and things that flirted with cancellation. Once they get, if you can get through the threat, the political challenge is basically done. You've made it through. Rarely do you go back and then have to fight for your life again. In a sense, everyone says, okay, you survived. It's not worth going after this because someone tried to cancel it. It failed. Clearly, there's a political coalition there. Put your efforts somewhere else. And so if MSR can make it through this and have a viable path forward, both programmatically and politically, I think there's a good chance then it does happen, that we don't have to face this again. But a lot of big projects sometimes just have to go through this choke point. And, maybe not the worst thing if you step back and say, keeps NASA hyper-focused, expectations at all levels of management. We can't screw this up because there isn't, and also for other projects, you don't have a blank check here. If you do mess this up real bad, you could lose this precious opportunity. So this is the big uncertainty right now.
This process that they're going through, where they're doing this internal review of the whole program and trying to figure out I guess effectively what the architecture changes will be, or maybe it's the same architecture, but we're just rebaselining the costs and all that kind of stuff. I'm trying not to be asking too cynical of a question, but how does this work? And when they come out the other end with now we've cracked it, it'll cost this much money and take this long. Why should politicians believe that any more than the last time, which was grossly off, right? Like, what is the difference? How do they, and even if they believe it more themselves, the ones generating the report, how do they express that difference to politicians that have to buy that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think in a way that has to be done, that's the challenge for NASA to address. I think at this point, it's helpful that you've had NASA initiated the independent review, the second independent review of MSR that led to this whole issue. And I mean, that in and of itself, I think is a really important step, that NASA recognized there was a problem and they asked people outside of NASA to evaluate it. And the people outside of NASA were not kind. I mean, they were like cruel, but they weren't generous. You know, they didn't give them any breaks. They said this program
very
was
frank.
managed.
Yeah,
yeah. There's no clear lines of authority.
They did what an independent review is supposed to do.
Yeah, it was very, and they gave them pathway. And I think that's the key, is if Congress and other outsiders, like my organization, frankly, you know, who are interested in MSR as a concept, but don't have a strong, you know, I don't have strong opinions, or the Planetary does not have strong opinions or any opinions about how technically it should be done, right? Yeah. I want them to do it, and I want them to do it well, and I want them to do it in a way that doesn't bankrupt everything else that NASA is trying to do. And I think NASA demonstrates that by saying, how did we address the particular points raised in this independent review? How have we addressed the management problems? How have we streamlined it? How have we demonstrate? How can we show that this is a priority at the highest level? I mean, that was one of the things that NASA leadership was called out as not prioritizing this. This is the biggest science project NASA has right now by a lot. And it has not been, doesn't seem to be, it's been difficult apparently from them to reach the highest levels of NASA for that support. So the more they can,
that was the thing.
Yeah, right. It's the more they can address that.
Yeah.
No one came to their to the MSR's birthday party, right?
Get more holidays, more holiday parties on that calendar. You got to do one. President's Day coming up. They got to have a big blowout this weekend down in Pasadena.
President's Day.
Lightly used MAV demonstration parts.
Yeah.
So the more I think they can show point by point how they've addressed those concerns. And you know, there becomes a bit of a splitting of hairs here. When we talk about cost estimates, NASA technically does not make a cost estimate, a formal cost estimate, until the program goes through key decision point C, right? And goes through formulation into implementation. They basically, which kind of makes sense. These things, for most stuff of what NASA does, never been built before. You don't have any idea how necessarily going to build it.
Made up until you get like enough sketched out on paper.
Yeah, I've been to. I mean, I assume most people here have been to NASA's Cost and Schedule Symposium meetings every year. You can call into them. There's a lot of smart people who work very hard to try to get better at this, but it is a fundamentally very difficult problem because it's a function of it's like a chaos function of internal and external perturbations that can completely throw off these highly interdependent complex systems. And something as big as, I had someone describe this to me once, was like, once you kind of get over $1 billion on a space project, you have some level of emergent complexity that is impossible to fully model and plan for, just because it gets there's so many inputs into this system. So something really big like MSR, right? Or, I mean, obviously the human spaceflight this is why human spaceflight stuff costs so much money all the time. But with MSR, it's very big. And so you have all these inputs, you have multiple centers, you have international partners, you have this huge supply chain, and you're doing something you've never done before. And it's all highly interdependent. And that was one of the issues with the IRB, right? You make a change in the diameter of your sample return orbiting cache bucket, or whatever your sphere that you would call it, and suddenly you're changing requirements in the CCRS that Goddard was making, and you're changing requirements inside the European mission, you know, all these other things, and the MAD itself.
I read that part of the IRB, and that was the one that keeps me up at night. That was like the specific technical thing where I was like, what are you guys thinking? Because like they described that of like the, you know, there's like that backwards cascade, because it's like, okay, well, ultimately what you want is the sample container on the ground on Earth. Like, yeah, that's what we're trying to get to. And it's like, okay, so design that requirement, and then you build the thing to build that, and you build the thing to build that, and you build it, and you just work backwards to the launch, right? And the process by which they change that diameter, like you said, they're like, well, if we take this many samples or this many samples, that decision, like, no one was in charge of it. It was like JPL would send an email to Marshall, and they'd like ask HQ, and the HQ would call JPL and be like, what do you guys think of this? Like, oh, let me go, I'll call Lockheed and they'll find out what's going on over there. Like, no one had
get to
that
like
decision.
what someone in Brussels is eating for lunch on Thursday.
Yeah,
it's like where you get to, like, if we can support that change.
Someone will call the ESA ambassador to NASA, and we'll get their opinion. Like, I was like, I can't believe this. Like, how are you getting? Like, obviously, they're not getting anything done. So like, that must be.
Yeah,
I had to yell about that.
Wait, is this a situation as the person in deep in these reports from either perspective of you two? Is this a case where it's like the sort of like the Artemis situation where there isn't like the central program office, but doesn't this have like a more of a program office? It does not.
It kind of does, but it's like it doesn't quite report into someone properly. That's kind of how I understand it, right?
It was, because there's the Mars Sample Return Project Office, and then JPL has a Mars Sample Return Program Office, and there's also the Mars Exploration Program, which was previously the responsibility for all other Mars missions run out of NASA headquarters, but also with a sub-program office at JPL that Perseverance is running, right? So Perseverance is being run out of the MEP. The MSR project was responsible for this project, but also, and supposedly supposed to answer directly to the top level Science Mission Directorate leadership, and it clearly had a hard time managing the interrelations because JPL was executing the sample return lander, Marshall was responsible for the launch, Goddard for the CCRS, and then whose job is it to do the full integration? I don't think that they had solved that necessarily. And I wondered, actually reading that, was maybe actually human spaceflight should have given some science mission directorate some pointers on how to organize this. Because you think about it, most science projects are the responsibility of a single NASA center. And this was a weird one that was, had so many NASA centers as major program inputs and not just subcontractors. And obviously human spaceflight does that all the time to mixed results, obviously, but they know how to, that's part of how they work. And I wonder if there was some inexperience on the SMD, NASA Science Mission Directorate side, of never really having a multi-directorate project like this at this scale.
Even not just multi-directorate, but just like kind of like multi-mission is pretty new for them too, right? Like every other mission's been like a standalone launch. They don't need to. Yeah, they don't need to really like.
Or maybe it's
in that same way.
Maybe the closest you're talking about is Viking, right? Because Viking was Langley built the landers and JPL built the orbiters, and it was launched in a combined. I think maybe JPL built the combined spacecraft to travel with, but it's launched then out of a Titan 4. I mean, right?
That era doesn't matter
around anymore, right?
No, but also that era doesn't matter.
Years ago. I'm just
that era was so like we'll just figure it out as we go, and we'll pull in whoever we need to. And I know the one guy who knows how that rocket works, so we'll call him in, and he'll come in on a Tuesday. And, that era was so Wild West.
But it's also Viking was and remains actually the most expensive planetary mission ever. Probably because of that.
Not the example you want to follow,
Well, and kind of also, you look at the history of this, which I have done, you see a huge spike in spending for planetary, and 2/3 of that is actually some of the highest it's ever been adjusted for inflation, around what it is now, around $3 billion a year, $3.5 billion a year. But it lasted for like 1 or 2 years, and then it was just for Viking, and then it completely collapsed. And 2/3 of all of planetary money was being spent on Viking. And that's not what you want, right? It was you did not have a balance. There wasn't even really a program. I mean, it was Viking. The moon had all wound down by that point, and then it was kind of finishing up some Mariner stuff, and then squeezing Voyager in there somewhere. And then I think Pioneer Venus was the last mission that Planetary did for
Yeah,
10 years,
because
basically.
if you have one mission taking up 2/3 of the planetary science budget, like that's just a way to say you can't afford it. to me.
Yeah, it's right. Yeah, Viking was baller. Like that mission was so wild. Like they's like, well, we're not sure if all the rovers are going to work, like because of the systems engineering. So let's just build
Send
3
2.
viable. We'll send 2, but we'll
That's
build
right.
3.
They built 3. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's the one in the Smithsonian is an actual flight rover
Yeah, it's a flight
spare.
article, yeah.
And then they were like, oh, the Titan 4 hasn't launched before. Well, they actually launched an entire Titan 4 as a demonstrator launch with a dummy payload paid by the Viking project.
Hell yeah.
Just to make sure that
that's
rocket,
rock.
and that's an expensive ass rocket. That's
yeah.
like a $500,000
probably
rocket.
if you adjusted for today's dollars, that's got to be top in the list. Like that was that was a wild rocket. Yeah. That had so much stuff on it.
You want me to? I actually do have that in today's dollars.
yes.
Pull it up.
Bring up the spreadsheet.
That's going to be on your gravestone, Casey. I do actually have that in today's dollars.
That's what I need as a T-shirt. Yeah, it's. I actually have a chart of
if you're
all
watching,
planetary launches plotted by time and mission-adjusted dollars. It's actually kind of crazy because what it shows you is how cheap the Delta II was. Delta II is basically gives you Falcon 9 prices. That's like it's incredibly affordable mission or rocket. That
Tori Bruno's like, hello, friends, I'm back. I'm 34% cheaper than everyone else in the market. Right now.
So Viking. Oh, it's maybe amortizing a little bit. Let's see. Viking was. How much was that launch? That was close. Not as much as I thought. It was Cassini was the big expensive launch. Cassini was like weirdly expensive. So Viking was about $310 million per launch. For the Titan 3, sorry, so the Titan 3E Centaur was the launch off of that. Titan 4 is what launched Cassini, and that was the big, chunky, expensive one. That was let's see where it was.
As opposed to $300 million.
A mere $300 million.
You actually can't buy a $300 million launch vehicle today, Casey. it's not on the market.
Well, they used to until very recently, I suppose.
That's what I mean.
But you're getting close, right?
I mean, if you really wanted to spend $300 million, somebody would sell you a rocket for $300 million.
The government can do it, but they have to build new fairings as part of it.
Get ready for this. You guys sitting down. Here's Cassini. Here's the Cassini Titan. And I've always actually questioned this number because it seems so big. And I've double checked. This is what they report in NASA budget.
Can we take guesses? Can we take guesses?
Sure. Yeah. Give me your guess.
Jake, what do you got?
This is a Titan 4B.
Titan 4, 2005?
The only time it's ever launched, 1997.
Oh, God. 2005 is when it got there or something. I don't know. All right.
2004, I think, is when it got to Saturn.
I'm going to say, are we doing like Price is Right rules? Like,
no, because then I'm going to say $1 or whatever. I already have a number in my mind.
If you have people in the comments, you can guess too. This is, we already gave it away. It's the most expensive planetary launch ever.
The number that came to my mind was $789 million for no reason at all.
Okay.
Wow, that's why. Wait, I'm going to go a little lower than that. I'm going to say like $675 million.
Okay. Well, you're both wrong. It's $834 million today's dollars for the launch of Cassini. It always seems money. High. I always wondered if there's an error, that something seems suspicious. But that's what I double checked.
If only we would fly your rope clipper on SLS, we could best this.
Yeah,
you know.
Actually, that would be kind of.
We would know there would be no way to calculate how much it costs, but it would beat it for sure. Like we know it's more than this, but we can't tell you how much.
Yeah, well, because obviously, this doesn't include all the costs of developing the Titan 4 and the ground systems and things at that point. I think it was one of the last launches of the Titan 4 too, if I remember correctly.
I wonder why.
Anyway, yeah, right. I mean, befitting of its name, Titan.
That's it.
Yeah, so a mere $300 million for Viking 1 and 2. So they just spent $300-ish million, right, launching a dummy payload on a Titan 3 just to make sure it worked. Titan again. Cadillac, the Cadillac of planetary missions.
They were swimming back then. Yeah, jeez.
Wow.
And then they didn't find. That's why I think people were so you're pissed that they didn't find life with it.
Or did they?
They spent all
the whole
this
thing,
money
right?
I was just at a workshop where people were quite vehemently saying that there was no, even poorly designed.
It's just the one guy, right, who's still on about
poorly. Yeah, well, the one whose
it was his thing, right?
But a good point was that all 3 of the tests were all testing for metabolism. And someone pointed out you need orthogonal tests. You need different types of ways in which you define life to test for that particular aspect of life. Because it turns out, I mean, that's the thing we didn't know at the time. Martian dirt soil is reactive, right? It's full of perchlorates. So you pour anything on it, and it's gonna give off some exogenous heat. And it's going to look like it's metabolizing stuff when it's really just it's highly a reactive chemical all spread around it. And that's a good example of why you do some groundwork first before you kind of make these broad, or also just kind of how ambitious life detection is, or how difficult it is, because you have to know what context. That's a different discussion. But I was just literally, we just had a big Search for Life workshop at the Planetary Society this week, so it's like my head is in astrobiology.
Good.
Okay, but there's life on Mars though, right, Casey?
Yeah, sure. That's why we need to do Mars sample return right now. Yeah,
we got to get the little microbes back. Yeah,
you know me. My thing is like that shit's everywhere. Like we found this. We're gonna react the same to life in like 20, 30, whatever, however many years. It's gonna be like what the last 10 years have been about water. Like there's water is only on Earth, and then it's like, actually, we found water on everything that we could possibly look at in the solar system. Everything has
Once
water.
we get those new space telescopes that are finding biosignatures in like every other exoplanet, right? It's like, oh, look, more like photosynthesis.
Yeah.
Bing, bing, bing. Well, there was again reminded in this topic, and I actually have a clipping from the New Yorker in like 1956 or something during one of the close approaches of Mars, right, where it's slightly bigger in the sky, and it was just, the New Yorker has a little like talk of the town blurbs sections. It was like this, it was all it was, a little talk of the town, like a paragraph long. As the scientists are excited about the upcoming close approach to observe with their telescopes because Mars changes colors with the seasons, probably because of vegetation or some type of algae. Scientists aren't quite sure, but this is, it's just like very nonchalant about Mars having vast seasonal vegetation,
huge forests.
Like, my God, it's like, and that's kind of like, will life change everything? I don't know. They seem pretty chill with it back in the 50s, right? This isn't even like 1820.
Actually, I'm firmly in that camp that it's going to be that not notable. Like,
it kind of depends if it's waving back at you. I think maybe the implications will be bigger, right? But it'll be like an interesting, notable thing, and then kind of like, hey, how can we fight each other again? Like, what are we angry about after all?
But what resources are they sitting on?
Yeah, exactly. All that good rust on Mars.
Before we get to the end of the show, I thought of this like 10 minutes ago as you were talking, and I would like to bring it up because there's very few things that Jake and I like doing on this show more than assigning homework to our favorite people in space media. And I thought of a really fun assignment the next time you're looking for some work. Okay? I would love, and I can help you out and work with this.
I know you're not very busy in your life, Casey. But
this
is a great time to take on extra projects.
For sure. So, and this one, I got to be honest, it sounds like a shitload of work. I would like to figure out what was the most accurate assessment of cost of a planetary mission of all time. Who did the best homework to end up front at the most reliable budget? And that doesn't mean they came in the lowest budget. Like if they estimated it was $1 billion and they were like, we only spent $400 million, they're out. I want people that called their shot. And we need $800 million and we spent like $799. Who is the best? Who is the GOAT?
May not be as hard as you're thinking, because I think I have all that data.
Boom.
Already.
Well, congrats. I just gave you a piece of content for the blog. But no, then the follow-on is, who was in charge of that? Please put them in charge of the MSR reviews.
Well, the reason why that may not work in the same way is that probably the things that are most successfully predicted are the most meat and potatoes type of missions, kind of ones you've done before.
Camera,
one CubeSat on a transporter mission.
All right. Use the Justice Potter Stewart. I'll know it when I see it. Like, give me the ones that are, equatable.
Like it's like what you would call the high heritage missions, right? Ones that don't really push the envelope in terms of engineering needs, and that's not necessarily. I mean, that's the inherent problem, right? Is that you. Also, the structure, and this is actually, I don't want to say this is an interesting way to put it. It was an interesting question. What interests me about this type of problem is how you organize missions in terms of the internal structure of organization. So in general, competed missions in NASA parlance, right? The missions that they put up, like a New Frontiers or Discovery class missions, where they say, here's a pot of money, pitch us your best idea that's going to do the best science. We'll have an team evaluate it. We'll kind of select a handful of you. We'll then put you through the ringer. We'll choose one, and that's what we'll do. Those tend to actually have the best performance. Really? Not just because they tend to be small. They tend to be smaller, so they have to be more straightforward. They're not flagships. But in the actual organization, you have they have a core team formed by a single principal investigator who selects themselves. They self-organize their science team. So that means all the instruments they select are known from the very beginning of the effort. They tend to be aligned and supported by a major industry partner. They do a ton of work in advance, maybe upwards of 5 to 10 years of work to get selected. So they know the problem really well. They know the potential engineering challenges. They've done probably a lot of testing and development of types of instrumentation. The entire instrument suite is known in advance, so they can design the spacecraft knowing exactly what types of observations. You look at something like New Horizons, which went to Pluto for $750 million with plutonium. It's like an astonishingly affordable mission. I think it's because you bring from the beginning. Flagship missions, on the other hand, they're directed. That means they're assigned to a NASA center. The NASA center puts out a call for instruments, and NASA themselves select an instrument package. They basically randomly assemble a team. Does that team work well together? Right. Not a function of the choices
no way to know until you do it. Yeah.
Aware of what other instruments that are being proposed? No, not really. And then the engineers say, okay, bolt these 8 instruments onto this spacecraft. Europa Clipper had a hell of a time with this, trying to get all the instrumentation to like not give E&M radiation onto each other, to like all fit on the same thing, right? And so they're doing this all kind of after the fact, and then it's really expensive. That adds complexity and cost. And so I think there's something to this idea of a core team selected early, driving the science from the beginning, limiting and controlling your engineering so it's really focused, and then not having to fix it later on in the process.
This makes me feel great about CLIPS, as we have one flying to the moon right now as we speak.
Well, CLIPS is interesting because it's like the exact opposite of that, right? Yeah. Because there's like
completely randomly assembled.
It's the freaking Kmart bin of science payloads.
We'll just like stick that here. Well, I call that, there's a really fascinating philosophical difference with CLIPS that I think a lot of the science world hasn't really internalized yet, which CLIPS is way more of the type of science I think of like some old British merchant ship from like the 19th century would be. It's like, all right, we're going to be going here. We're going to be trading some spices. We're going to be going to like Indonesia. We'll take a naturalist.
Like, please take me with you.
But they're like, okay, we're going to be at this island to restock. Yeah, sure, walk around, pick up some birds or something for a couple hours. But, that's it. That's all. You get to whatever we're doing, you get to ride along and take the opportunity. You do that stuff that way. That is not how science has worked in this country since the post-World War II era, where the scientists get to define their own questions, and then they propose the missions to answer their own questions, and get to designate to those missions exactly how they're going to solve those questions through their own instrumentation, right? So science is the driving priority that then everything is designed around. Whereas CLIPS is back to this opportunistic science, right? Of like, hey, we're going here. Sure, stick something on it. Like if you think that'll be interesting, see what you find. But it's not why we're going there. It's useful to you, but it's not the purpose. And we haven't done that. Space science really, Apollo arguably at least was maybe that for geologists, but it's a different way of doing business. And I think scientists themselves may find it to be less satisfying or frustrating because they're used to kind of, in a sense, calling the shots. But also, maybe find some, if it's a lower cost and you get more shots on it, you're learning something. And the question is, are you learning the most important stuff? And this, if I had to critique, and not necessarily even critiquing CLIPS because it's just part of a larger portfolio now. But for those of people who I think that, we'll just do commercial everything and science will just kind of happen as a commercial byproduct, you can answer things that way. You can learn things that way. But you probably aren't learning the most important things that way. You aren't probably pushing the boundaries of the biggest questions that way because by definition, they're going to be hard to achieve. And that's why we're doing it. In a sense, all of this hubbub around, is that even around Mars sample return? why is this all of a hassle, right? Like, why don't we just have Starship pick up some rocks or something when it comes back? It's because the samples that are being collected by Perseverance are being very purposely and carefully and precisely collected in order to answer very specific, huge questions about not just the history of Mars, but the history of the solar system, right? Like the implications of these go way beyond Mars. It's like you're trying to, ideally, out of the sample return, you get to a second place beyond the moon to locate in time major eras of solar system past, like the bombardments, to ground your estimates of the age surface of Mars, and then you can tie it to crater counting. You can basically reset the chronology of the entire solar system based on what you find on Mars. And that's if you don't find history of life. And that type of stuff, you don't necessarily answer those questions if you just randomly pick up a few rocks, right? This is why Perseverance has taken already 2 years to collect the samples, and we'll be collecting very, I know people on the team, they're arguing for months and years about which exact ones to do, and they all have to trace back to these fundamental questions. And that's why we want to make it harder for ourselves than we have to, because we're trying to answer very hard questions. And I think that's at the core of all of this. I think before people get too frustrated at NASA for messing everything up, we are taking the hardest way to do this in order to actually try to answer, to swing at these big questions.
Nailed it.
I finished it. I landed the plane.
Democracy is slow and messy. But it's better than the alternative. So
I've changed my homework assignment. What factor? How do I even phrase what my new homework assignment is? I need the factor of wrongness for new starts, right? Like when it was a fresh mission. So none of your, like, don't sandbag me with, like, well, we flew this Phoenix lander before. Fresh mission, new designs, new instruments. What was the factor of wrongness for all the missions, and who had the least factor of wrongness? And what was the average factor of wrongness, so we can calculate it on everything else? Like Viper. Like, how far off is Viper going to be?
Yeah.
Like,
well, and
2x, 3x? Pretty
far off. Yeah.
And assuming it makes it in one piece to the surface too. Like, do you have to rerun a Viper? The data, I think, is in this is a plug for those of you who, maybe this is a great homework assignment for the audience, to go to my Planetary Exploration Budget data set, open and accessible to anybody for free at the Planetary Society. It should be in there. So the question would be, where do you draw your comparison line? Because again, NASA won't make a formal budget estimate until it enters phase C, after it's spent tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. Thank you. Yes. And that's when they will publish it. So in my data set, I published the initial life cycle cost estimate, which also includes launch and includes operations through the prime mission, which can vary, right? So you're talking about cost through operations, you're talking about just development cost. All those numbers are in there. You can tease them out. Or do you want like the initial kind of best guess cost when they announce the mission, right? This is what got James Webb into hot water. And this is what's getting MSR into hot water now. They put $5.3 billion in the Planetary Science Decadal. Probably a bad idea in retrospect, because that was not the true estimate. They didn't know even how to estimate it, right? That was just a number that sounded reasonable. And that's what the Senate's throwing back in their face. James Webb, same thing. James Webb, they always say, like, oh, it started out as a $1 billion project and it was 8.8. Well, no, the actual life cycle cost estimate of James Webb was something like $4.5 billion back in 2006. So it doubled. Not great, but better than a factor of 8.
Yeah.
It just depends where you draw the line for it. The less NASA, I don't know, people always they put out a guess. It's always wrong, profoundly, incredibly wrong. An interesting thing, you could even say like Europa Clipper, right? So a $5 billion mission now. That was the cheap option, the Clipper, from the Decadal survey estimate in 2011 of a Europa orbiter, which was $4.7 billion. Right. So it actually kind of came out, the estimate came out for the cheaper option to be what the too expensive orbiter was going to be.
This is what I'm saying, though, if we establish a baseline factor of wrongness, we can at least do math when one of these like off the napkin numbers is thrown out, we can apply the average factor of wrongness.
Go to the next.
I'll do it. Is what you're telling me is I should do the homework? I'll do the homework.
Do the homework. Yeah. I mean, seriously, you could go to the cost and schedule symposium. I presented there once on the budget.
I'm going to present my factor of wrongness theory at this symposium. That's my goal.
Write a paper. Write a paper.
The factor of wrongness.
There you go.
Colangelo et al.
Yeah, maybe I can finally get a law named after myself.
I do it. The data's out there. It can be done.
So
you can have a unit of measurement for how far off you are. 1 colangelo.
1 colangelo.
one colangelo is like that's the average. That's like what most units you see. So if you can get under 1 colangelo, you're good. But if you're like 2-3 colangelos, get out of here.
All right. Well, now that we've envisioned this future, I feel like I need to take this project on. So.
Yeah.
This is great.
Have me on when you're ready to share it. We'll talk about it.
Yeah. Casey wants that co-author. Get him on there.
Yeah, that's great.
Yes.
Casey, you've written some great pieces about this whole situation. So a little bit about what's happening with MSR, and you also have some stuff about what people can actually do, at least in the United States, because they have influence as voters over this process. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and Day of Action and all that cool stuff you're doing?
Yeah. So this is, putting on my advocacy hat, taking off my policy hat. We do have ways to help, and we try to be very cautious, or not cautious, but we want to be careful and conscientious of how we support this, right? Because our goal isn't to have MSR at all costs. Our goal isn't to destroy other science programs to do this. Like we need to push NASA to have a smarter implementation, obviously, and we need to have, we can't destroy other projects, or else it just politically is not going to work. It can't, and it's the wrong thing to do. So the way that we talk about it, is how we're reflecting it. So planetary.org/action will take you to our action center. You can write letter right now if you live in the US for MSR and NASA science. And then if you really care about it, which I think we all should, and live in the US, we are going to visit Congress on April 28th and 29th of this year. That's our Day of Action. We will provide, so you have to fly yourself out there. Unfortunately, we can't give everyone flights to DC, but once you're there and registered with us, we'll give you in-person training, talking points. We'll put you with a group of people who have experience with doing this. We'll tell you how to say it, what to say if you want, and then kind of let your passion shine through with that. And we'll we'll book your meetings with your members of Congress. You'll get to have opportunities to drop in at other offices throughout Congress. And you'll have opportunities to hang out with other Planetary Society members and fans of space. And me and my colleagues will all be there. It's always actually a really fun time. It can feel intimidating, but it's actually, and frankly, a lot of people come out of it with the renewed optimism about our messy system of democracies, which is always a nice little bonus too. And that's at planetary.org/Day of Action.
Yeah, and I say this every year, but I'll say it again. But we have listeners that go to this and tell us how rewarding and fun it is. So I definitely encourage it. Makes me wish I was an American and could go too.
Yeah, I feel like I should. I'm like dumb that I never came down and hung out. And
what are you doing, buddy?
I feel like I gotta look at the calendar. I don't know why I haven't. It seems like a plausible time for me to make it down to DC. So, also April in DC is great. So.
Yeah, it should be a relatively nice time of year, and it'll be a good time of year too. The new budget will be out. We're still 6 months away from the elections. I won't be completely insane.
New and old budget both be out. Yeah, I maybe done my factor of wrongness work, so maybe I can roll that out in the halls of Congress.
You can apply that to a political situation. I've had some articles out. I'll have more articles coming out next week, kind of going into a deeper budget analysis of MSR. And I'll have an op-ed coming out in Scientific American tomorrow or the day after, talking about MSR as well. So we're doing a lot of outreach about this within this broader effort. But yeah, it's a big issue. And at the end of the day, this is the highest priority of the scientific community, planetary science community. It's through this process of the decadal survey, right? And if we just decide not to do hard things that are the top priority of the science community, it may be convenient for other projects right now in terms of opening up some money, but all science priorities will be threatened in the long run by this because we start walking away from this process. So there's a larger thing. NASA has to figure this out, but we also have to muster the effort. Like, this is going to be a hard thing. There's a reason no one's tried this before. And NASA has pulled itself out of worse situations. And I'm optimistic, or at least positive, with the fact that we can get through this. It just needs to, this is the choke point, right? And this is the big test. And this will hopefully whip everyone into shape. We'll see this happen eventually.
All right. Well, from your lips to Congress' ears.
That's literally my job, right?
And NASA's, yeah. Get that report done. Awesome. Wow, this has been so much fun. I'm really glad we had you on. I needed this talk. I needed to have this conversation. I feel good. I feel a lot better now. I feel like it was a little dicey before.
Well, anytime. And I'm not an optimist by nature.
No, me neither. So that's good.
Yeah. I'm in the wrong business in some ways.
We keep everybody on check. There's a role for us.
Yeah. This is a classic example of space being it's like the antidote to cynicism, because you literally have to be optimistic to do anything in space. And then you think about the motives of why we're doing this at the end of the day, and the ability that it does have to draw people and nations and efforts together. Like it's like the most earnest and corny and beautiful thing that we do as a civilization. And it's good to remember that from time to time. So even my wife chastised me because this is an absurd. I tried to write this down, but it didn't come off quite right. But I'll try this here. It's, how Aristotle's cosmology was the idea that we had all these like celestial spheres, where like the furthest sphere out was the most perfect because it didn't change, and that's where the stars were. And then the Earth was like this corrupted, mutable, nasty place.
Chaos.
And it's like, well, of course it makes sense, that we, like, maybe we're a bit more Aristotelian than we think, because all this messiness to create the spacecraft, they're going to go out into the firmament, right? And it's so pristine and beautiful and perfect that it raises out the contrast of our mutable, messy process of building the thing on Earth that we will send out there. And MSR is doubly hard because we're sending it out into perfection and bringing it back to the messy Earth. So those poor rocks. But that was my pitch, is that we have a pseudo Aristotelian cosmology after all, at least in the process of space policy.
We got to get those poor rocks stamped on one of the spacecraft that's doing MSR. We have to.
Just minding their own business on Mars
those
for 4
rocks.
billion years.
That's too good.
Anyway,
that's my
air overindulgent pseudo-intellectual nonsense that I took out of the piece.
Perfect way to end.
Are you sure it's just water in that little thermos you have there?
Yeah, right.
It's a sleep deprivation.
Well, water with exactly. No sleep for 6 months. It's a little more.
Too many biosignatures.
Yes, right.
Too good.
Awesome. Well,
all
Casey,
right.
Thanks so much for coming on. This is fantastic. Love having you on the show.
The best.
We'll get you back soon again. Yeah.
And you were the only one that could deflect homework back to me, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a skill you learn.
That's me.
You've got to learn that. Yeah.
All right. See y'all.
All right, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah, we'll see ya.